The gunshot echoed through Concord, Texas, as Lillian Summers sprinted down the dusty Main Street, her skirts hiked up past her ankles, propriety be damned. It was 1875, and she had just witnessed 3 men robbing the bank where she worked as the only female teller. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she ran toward the sheriff's office, praying someone would help before those men made off with the town's savings. She collided with something solid, or rather, someone. Strong hands steadied her, and Lillian found herself staring up at a tall figure silhouetted against the merciless Texas sun. The man's face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed black hat pulled low over his eyes, but she could make out a strong jawline dusted with stubble. "Whoa there," he said, his voice deep and smooth as aged whiskey. "Where's the fire, madam?" "The bank," Lillian gasped, pointing frantically down the street. "3 men there robbing it. Sheriff Morris isn't in his office, and Mr. Hadley, the manager, is held at gunpoint." The stranger's expression hardened. Without another word, he released her and drew his revolver in one fluid motion. "Stay here," he commanded, already moving toward the bank. "Wait," Lillian called after him. "Who are you?" He paused just long enough to glance back at her. "Name's Marshall Rhodes. Just passing through." Lillian watched as he approached the bank with the confidence of a man who'd faced danger many times before. His movements were precise, calculated, nothing like the town's sheriff who spent more time nursing whiskey than upholding the law. This Marshall Rhodes moved like a predator, and despite her fear, she found herself following him at a distance. She crouched behind a water trough as Marshall reached the bank's entrance. The commotion inside was audible even from where she hid: shouts, threats, the sound of someone being struck. Marshall didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open and disappeared inside. More gunshots rang out, 1, 2, 3 in quick succession. Then silence fell, heavy and terrifying. Lillian's hands trembled as she waited, counting heartbeats. Finally, Marshall emerged, herding 2 men with their hands bound behind their backs. A third man lay slung over his shoulder. "Is he?" Lillian couldn't finish the question as she stepped out from her hiding place. "Just unconscious," Marshall replied, his expression unreadable beneath that hat. "Would you mind fetching the sheriff now? I'd appreciate some help with these fellows." Within the hour, the town of Concord was buzzing with gossip about the mysterious stranger who'd single-handedly thwarted the robbery. Sheriff Morris, who'd been enjoying a long lunch at the saloon, had taken credit for coordinating the response. But everyone knew the truth. Lillian found Marshall at the livery stable as the sun began to set, preparing to leave town as quietly as he'd arrived. "You're not staying?" she asked, surprised by her own disappointment. He adjusted his saddle straps without looking up. "Never stay anywhere long. The bank manager wants to reward you. The whole town's talking about what you did." Marshall shook his head. "Don't need a reward for doing what's right, miss." "Summers." "Lillian Summers," she supplied, extending her hand. "At least stay for supper. My father owns the Golden Nugget restaurant down the street. Best food in 3 counties, or so folks claim." For the first time, Marshall looked directly at her, and Lillian caught a glimpse of striking blue eyes beneath the shadow of his hat. He seemed to consider her offer for a moment before nodding once. "1 meal," he agreed. "Then I'll be on my way." The Golden Nugget was packed that evening, every patron eager to catch a glimpse of the hero of the day. Lillian's father, Theodore Summers, insisted on serving Marshall personally, refusing payment and plying him with the restaurant's finest offerings. "So, Mr. Rhodes," Theodore said, pouring Marshall another cup of coffee, "what brings you to our little corner of Texas?" Marshall shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Just traveling through, sir." "To where, if you don't mind my asking?" "Wherever the trail leads," Marshall replied cryptically, and Lillian noticed how he never removed his hat. Even at the dinner table, something her father would normally consider the height of bad manners, but seemed willing to overlook given the circumstances. Over the next hour, townsfolk came by their table to thank Marshall, shake his hand, or simply gawk. He received their gratitude with quiet dignity but offered little about himself in return. "Lillian," seated across from him, found herself studying the mysterious man who'd saved her life and possibly the town's future. He wasn't classically handsome like some of the young men who'd courted her in the past. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a thin scar running along his jawline. But there was something compelling about him, a stillness, a watchfulness that made her feel both protected and slightly unnerved. "You're not much for conversation, are you, Mr. Rhodes?" she finally asked when they had a moment alone. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Never found much use for unnecessary words." "And what words do you consider necessary?" His eyes met hers again. Warnings, truths, promises. There was something in the way he said promises that made Lillian's heart skip a beat. "And do you make many of those, Mr. Rhodes, promises?" "Only ones I can keep," he answered. And for a brief moment, his expression softened before he glanced away, tugging his hat lower as if to hide whatever emotion had threatened to surface. By the time dinner ended, Marshall had reluctantly agreed to stay the night at the town's small hotel, rather than camping outside of town as he'd planned. Lillian wasn't entirely sure why she felt relieved at this news, but as she bid him good night on the restaurant's porch, she found herself hoping he might stay longer than just one night. "Thank you again," she said, "for what you did today." Marshall nodded, his hat shadowing his features in the lamplight. "Just happened to be in the right place." "Well, I'm glad you were," Lillian replied. "Will I see you tomorrow before you leave?" He hesitated, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Perhaps." Lillian watched him walk away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness. There was a story behind that man, behind that ever-present hat, and despite her better judgment, she found herself desperate to discover what it was. Morning arrived with unexpected news. The bank robbers Marshall had captured were part of the notorious Blackburn gang, wanted in 3 states. The reward for their capture was substantial, and Sheriff Morris insisted that Marshall come to his office to claim it. Lillian spotted Marshall entering the sheriff's office as she walked to work. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, simple, well-worn, but clean. And of course, the same black hat, pulled low over his brow despite the early hour. Later that morning, Marshall appeared at the bank, catching Lillian by surprise as she counted out change for Mrs. Peterson. "Mr. Rhodes," she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "I thought you'd be halfway to wherever by now." "Had some business to attend to," he replied, waiting until Mrs. Peterson had left before approaching the counter. He slid an envelope across to Lillian. "For the bank. The reward money for those robbers." Lillian stared at the envelope, then back at him. "All of it, but it's yours. You earned it." Marshall shook his head. "The bank was robbed. Seems right the money goes back where it belongs. That's very honorable," Lillian said, genuinely impressed. "But surely you can keep some of it." "Don't need it," he said simply. "Got everything I require." Lillian wasn't sure what compelled her next words. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, a connection she'd felt from that first collision on the street. "Will you at least stay for the town's Founders' Day celebration tomorrow? There's a dance in the evening." "It would be my honor to accompany you." Marshall went very still, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. For a moment, Lillian thought he would refuse, but then he gave a slight nod. "Until tomorrow, then." Over the next day, Lillian learned bits and pieces about Marshall Rhodes from town gossip. The telegraph operator mentioned he'd sent a wire to someone in Austin. The blacksmith noted he'd had his horse reshod but refused help, doing much of the work himself. The hotel owner commented that he kept to himself, rising before dawn and returning after dark. No one, however, could say where he'd come from or why he kept his hat on at all times during meals, indoors even, according to the hotel clerk, while having his bath prepared. The evening of the Founders' Day celebration arrived warm and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue sky. Lanterns were strung across the town square, and a band set up on a small wooden platform. Ladies in their finest dresses promenaded on the arms of gentlemen in pressed suits, while children raced between the food tables set up along the edges of the square. Lillian waited nervously on her front porch, wearing her best dress, a deep green satin that her mother had helped her remake from last year's style. Her father had expressed concern about her accompanying a man they knew so little about, but Lillian had assured him that Marshall Rhodes was a hero, not a threat. Still, as the minutes ticked by without any sign of him, Lillian began to wonder if he'd changed his mind or worse, left town without saying goodbye. Just as she was about to give up hope, she spotted him walking up the path to her house. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His clothes, while still simple, were clean and pressed. He'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline free of the stubble from days before. And his hat, that ever-present black hat, looked brushed free of dust. "Miss Summers," he greeted her, removing the hat just long enough to give a small bow before replacing it immediately. "You look beautiful." Lillian felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Rhodes." They walked to the town square together, their conversation easier than it had been before. Marshall asked about her family, her work at the bank, her life in Concord. She learned that he'd been traveling for nearly 5 years, that he was handy with horses and machinery, and that he knew more about the stars than anyone she'd met. "My father taught me," he explained as they paused to look up at the night sky between dances. "Said a man could never be truly lost if he knew how to read the stars." "And have you ever been lost, Mr. Rhodes?" Lillian asked, meaning more than just geographically. His eyes met hers, and for a moment his guard seemed to drop. "More times than I care to admit." The band struck up a waltz and Marshall hesitated before offering his hand. "Would you care to dance, Miss Summers?" Lillian placed her hand in his. "I'd be delighted, but only if you'll call me Lillian." A small smile touched his lips. "Lillian," he said, as if testing the feel of her name. "Then you must call me Marshall." He was a surprisingly good dancer, guiding her confidently through the steps of the waltz. Lillian was acutely aware of the eyes watching them, the mysterious stranger and the banker's daughter, turning beneath the lantern light. For once, she didn't mind the attention. "You dance well for a man who claims to spend most of his time alone on the trail," she observed. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," he replied. "Said it was as important as knowing how to shoot straight." "And do you?" "Shoot straight, I mean." His smile widened slightly. "Straight enough to get by." As the evening progressed, Lillian found herself increasingly drawn to this enigmatic man. He was different from the boys she'd grown up with, more mature, more measured in his words and actions. When he looked at her, she felt truly seen, not just admired for her appearance or her family's position in town. Yet through it all, that hat remained firmly in place. Even when other men removed theirs out of respect while talking to ladies or during particularly energetic dances, Marshall kept his on. Lillian couldn't help wondering why, but something told her not to ask, not yet. The celebration was winding down when Sheriff Morris approached them, his expression grim. "Rhodes," he said, nodding curtly. "Got word from Austin. Seems the rest of the Blackburn gang is headed this way, looking for their friends. Might arrive as soon as tomorrow." Marshall's posture changed instantly, tension radiating from him. "How many?" "5, maybe 6, Morris replied. "I've called for help from the Rangers, but the nearest patrol is 2 days out." Lillian watched Marshall's face, saw the conflict there. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked quietly after the sheriff had walked away. Marshall turned to her, and for the first time she saw real regret in his eyes. "Those men are dangerous, Lillian. They don't take kindly to folks who interfere with their business. So you'll just run, leave us to face them." The words came out harsher than she intended, his jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me," she challenged. Marshall took her arm gently, leading her away from the curious onlookers. "I don't bring trouble to innocent people," he said, his voice low. "Those men are coming for me as much as for their gang members. If I stay, I put everyone in danger." "And if you go, we're defenseless," Lillian countered. "Sheriff Morris can barely stay sober long enough to make his rounds, and most of the men in town are farmers, not fighters." Marshall was silent for a long moment, his internal struggle visible despite the shadow cast by his hat. Finally, he sighed. "I'll stay until the Rangers arrive, help organize the town's defense, but then I have to move on." Relief flooded through Lillian, followed quickly by a sharp pang at the thought of his inevitable departure. "Thank you." They walked back to her house in contemplative silence. At her front door, Marshall hesitated, then took her hand in his. "Lillian, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "Yes," she prompted, heart racing. Instead of speaking, he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night," he said softly, releasing her and stepping back. Lillian watched him walk away, confused by the tumult of emotions she felt. In just 3 days, this stranger had upended her orderly life, making her question everything she thought she wanted. As she prepared for bed, she realized with startling clarity that she was falling for Marshall Rhodes' hat and all. The next morning dawned with an air of tension hanging over Concord. Word of the approaching gang had spread, and the town was gripped by fear. Marshall wasted no time, gathering the men at the town hall to organize a defense. Lillian watched from the doorway as he spoke, his quiet authority commanding respect even from those initially skeptical of an outsider taking charge. "The Blackburn gang isn't known for mercy," he explained, pointing to a map of the town he'd sketched. "They'll expect us to cower, maybe try to negotiate. We use that expectation against them." For hours, Marshall drilled the men, teaching them basic defensive positions, how to communicate without speaking, when to hold fire and when to shoot. He transformed shopkeepers and farmers into a makeshift militia, his patience never wavering even with the clumsiest among them. By mid-afternoon, Lillian had organized the women to prepare the town hall as both a fortress and a hospital, gathering supplies and creating a safe haven for children and the elderly. When she stepped outside to fetch more water, she found Marshall talking with her father. "Appreciate your concern, Rhodes," Theodore was saying, "but this is our home. We won't abandon it." Marshall nodded, his expression grim beneath his hat. "Then we make sure it stays your home, sir." He turned, noticing Lillian for the first time. Something in his face softened. "Your father has agreed to let the bank serve as one of our defensive positions. The safe room in back could protect a dozen people if needed." "And where will you be?" Lillian asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Wherever I'm needed most," he replied, then hesitated before adding, "I'd feel better knowing you were safely out of town." "Your father mentioned your aunt in Dallas. I'm not leaving," Lillian interrupted firmly. "I can shoot, ride, and bandage wounds. I'm staying to help." Marshall studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Just be careful, please." That single please carried more emotion than anything else he'd said to her, and Lillian felt something shift between them, a deepening of whatever connection had been forming since their first meeting. As dusk approached, scouts reported riders approaching from the south, at least 7 men, heavily armed. Marshall positioned the townspeople according to his plan, with sharpshooters in the church bell tower and hotel upper floors, others behind barricades hastily erected across the main street. "Remember," he told them, checking his revolver one last time, "we don't want a bloodbath. Our aim is to convince them that taking their friends back isn't worth the cost." Lillian, stationed inside the bank with her father and 2 other men, watched through the window as Marshall walked alone into the middle of the street, standing tall and unmistakable in the fading light, his hat a defiant silhouette against the sunset. The Blackburn gang entered town slowly, their leader a barrel-chested man with a red beard and a face like cured leather. They pulled up short at the sight of Marshall standing alone, seemingly unafraid. "That's far enough," Marshall called, his voice carrying in the tense silence. Well, the leader drawled. "If it ain't the hero who took down my boys, figured you'd be long gone by now." "Your boys are headed to prison, Blackburn," Marshall replied evenly. "You can join them or you can ride away. Your choice." Blackburn laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "Just you against all of us. Those ain't good odds, friend." Marshall didn't move. "Look around. Every window, every rooftop, there's a gun trained on you right now. Your men wouldn't make it 10 feet. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Blackburn's face as he scanned the seemingly deserted buildings. You're bluffing. In response, Marshall gave a subtle signal with his hand. Immediately, a dozen men revealed themselves at windows and on rooftops, rifles gleaming in the last light of day. No bluff, Marshall said quietly. Just a simple choice. Leave now or don't leave at all. For a moment the world held its breath. Lillian's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Then Blackburn spat in the dirt. "This ain't over," he growled, turning his horse. "I don't forget a face." "Neither do I," Marshall replied, not moving until the last rider had disappeared from view. The town erupted in cheers as Marshall walked back to the defensive positions, checking that everyone was maintaining vigilance. "They might circle back," he warned. "We keep watch through the night." Hours later, when it became clear the gang truly had retreated, Lillian found Marshall sitting alone on the bank's steps, staring into the darkness. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed," she said, settling beside him. He glanced at her, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "Sometimes they're the same thing. You knew they might shoot you where you stood." Marshall shrugged. "Better me than half the town in a gunfight." Lillian studied his profile in the moonlight, taking in the strong lines of his face beneath that ever-present hat. "Why did you really stay, Marshall? You could have left before they arrived." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean closer to hear. "Maybe I found a reason to stand my ground for once." The way he looked at her then made Lillian's breath catch in her throat. Before she could respond, a shout came from down the street, one of the watchmen. Marshall was on his feet instantly, hand on his revolver. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving toward the commotion. Lillian watched him go, her mind swirling with unspoken words and unfamiliar emotions. Whatever his reason for staying, she was grateful for it, and terrified of what would happen when he inevitably left. Dawn broke with news that 2 of Blackburn's men had tried to sneak back into town during the night to free their imprisoned companions. They'd been captured without bloodshed, thanks to Marshall's carefully planned watch rotations. The town celebrated their victory with relief and growing admiration for the stranger who'd saved them twice now. Sheriff Morris, sobered by the night's events, sent another telegram to the Rangers, updating them on the situation. "They'll be here by tomorrow afternoon," he told Marshall as they secured the new prisoners. "Figure they'll want to take all 4 back to Austin together." Marshall nodded, his expression unreadable beneath his hat. "I'll be moving on then, too." Lillian, who had brought coffee to the men standing watch, felt her heart sink at his words. Tomorrow, just one more day, and he would be gone from her life as suddenly as he'd entered it. Throughout the day, she found reasons to be near him, bringing food to the jail, helping organize the town's continued vigilance, offering to mend a tear in his coat sleeve. Marshall seemed equally drawn to her, his eyes following her movements, finding excuses to check on her well-being. By evening, an unspoken tension had built between them, filled with things neither seemed able to say. When Marshall escorted her home after her shift at the makeshift hospital, they walked slowly, as if trying to stretch the moments together. "Will you tell me where you're headed next?" Lillian asked as they reached her porch. Marshall looked out at the darkening sky. "North, maybe. Haven't decided yet. Just wandering. It's what I do," he said simply. Lillian gathered her courage. "It doesn't have to be. You could stay, Marshall. The town would welcome you." "We need a deputy sheriff, and after what you've done, I can't," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "This isn't the life for me, Lillian. Because of your hat." The words escaped before she could stop them. Marshall went very still. "What?" Lillian flushed but pressed on. "I've noticed everyone has you never remove your hat. Not indoors, not at the dinner table, not even at the dance. There's a reason, isn't there? Something you're hiding." For a moment she thought he might walk away without answering. His jaw tightened and his eyes, shadowed by the hat's brim, became unreadable. "It's late," he finally said. "You should go inside." "Marshal, please." Lillian reached for his hand. "Whatever it is, good night, Miss Summers," he said formally. Withdrawing his hand from hers and turning to leave, Lillian watched him walk away, her heart aching with regret. She'd pushed too far, asked for more than he was willing to give. As tears stung her eyes, she whispered, "I'm sorry," though he was already too far to hear. Sleep eluded her that night. Lillian tossed and turned, replaying their conversation, wondering if she'd lost whatever chance they might have had. By morning, she'd resolved to find him before the Rangers arrived and apologized, to tell him that his secrets were his own, that she'd respect his privacy if only he'd consider staying, or at least returning someday. She dressed quickly and headed to the hotel, only to be told by the clerk that Marshall had checked out at dawn. Panic rising, Lillian rushed to the livery stable, praying she wasn't too late. She found him there, saddling his horse, his few belongings already packed. He looked up at her approach, surprise evident in his expression. "Lillian," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I didn't expect to see you this morning." "I had to come," she replied, catching her breath. "I needed to apologize for last night. I shouldn't have pried, whatever your reasons for. For your hat, for your traveling, they're yours. I had no right to demand explanations." Marshall's hand stilled on the saddle straps. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said quietly. "It was a fair question. Then why won't you answer it?" The words were out before she could stop them, and Lillian immediately regretted her impulsiveness. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "No," Marshall interrupted, turning to face her fully. "You deserve an answer." He hesitated, then gestured to a bench at the side of the stable. "Would you sit with me?" Just for a moment. Heart pounding, Lillian sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body in the cool morning air. Marshall stared at his hands for a long moment before speaking. "5 years ago I was a different man, had a small ranch outside of Austin, a wife, a son on the way." Lillian's breath caught. "You're married." "Was," he corrected, pain evident in his voice. "There was a fire. I was in town selling cattle by the time I got back." He swallowed hard. "The house was gone, so was she." "Marshall, I'm so sorry," Lillian whispered, fighting the urge to take his hand. "That day," he continued, his voice rough with emotion, "she'd given me this hat as a gift, said every proper rancher needed a good hat." A sad smile touched his lips. "I was wearing it when I found what was left of our home, and I swore then I wouldn't take it off until I found peace with what happened." "But it's been 5 years," Lillian said gently. Marshall nodded. 5 years of running from the memories. 5 years of blaming myself for not being there when she needed me." He finally looked at Lillian, his eyes filled with a grief so raw it took her breath away. "How do you find peace with something like that?" In that moment, Lillian understood everything: his reluctance to stay in one place, his need to help others, his distance despite their obvious connection. "Is that why you're always moving? Why you won't let yourself get close to anyone?" "The hat is my reminder," he said simply. "Of what I lost. Of what happens when I let myself believe in permanence, in happiness." Lillian's heart broke for him, even as a small flame of hope flickered within her. He had shared his deepest pain with her, surely that meant something. "Marshall," she said carefully, "what happened to your wife was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. And wearing that hat, punishing yourself for years, do you truly think that's what she would have wanted for you?" He flinched as if her words had physically struck him. "I don't know any more," he admitted. "I just know I'm not the same man who left her that morning. That man died in the ashes of his home." "No," Lillian said firmly, "that man is still here. I've seen him in the way you risked your life for strangers, in how you gave away the reward money, in the gentleness with which you've treated me." She gathered her courage and reached for his hand. This time, he didn't pull away. "You haven't lost your capacity for good, Marshall. Maybe not for love either." Marshall looked down at their joined hands, conflict written across his features. "I don't know if I can be what you deserve, Lillian." "I'm not asking for promises," she replied softly, "just possibility." Before he could respond, the stable boy burst in, eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Rhodes, Rangers are coming. Just rode into town." Marshall withdrew his hand from Lillian's, standing quickly. "Thank you, son," he said, reaching for his horse's reins. Lillian rose too, suddenly desperate. "Marshall, please, I have to give my report," he said, not meeting her eyes. "They'll need details about the gang members." "And then?" she asked, hating the tremble in her voice. He paused, one hand on his saddle. "I don't know," he admitted. "I need time to think." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it wasn't a goodbye either. Lillian nodded, blinking back tears. "I'll be at the bank if you want to talk more." Marshall finally looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "Thank you, Lillian, for listening, for understanding." She watched him lead his horse out of the stable, his tall figure straight and proud despite the burden he carried. For the first time, she saw his hat not as a mystery, but as a shield against a pain too great to bear alone. The Rangers' arrival brought a flurry of activity to Concord. 4 experienced lawmen, they took custody of the Blackburn gang members with efficient professionalism, praising the town's defense efforts. Lillian caught glimpses of Marshall throughout the day as he conferred with the Rangers, his expertise evident in the respect they showed him. By late afternoon, preparations were complete for the prisoners' transport to Austin. The Rangers would depart at dawn, and with them, Lillian assumed, Marshall would ride away too out of her life forever. She was closing up the bank, her heart heavy, when the door opened. Lillian looked up to find Marshall standing there, his expression uncertain. "I thought you might have already left," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not yet." He removed his hat, actually removed it, holding it in his hands as he approached the counter. Without it, Lillian could see a scar along his hairline and the slight gray at his temples that the hat had concealed. "I wanted to thank you properly before I go." "So you are leaving," Lillian said, the last of her hope fading. Marshall nodded. "The Rangers asked me to ride with them to Austin. Help testify against the Blackburn gang." "I see." Lillian busied herself with the ledger, not trusting herself to look at him without breaking down. "Well, safe travels, Mr. Rhodes. Concord won't forget what you did for us." "Lillian," Marshall said softly, and something in his tone made her look up. "I'd like to give you something." Before she could respond, he placed his hat on the counter between them. Lillian stared at it, uncomprehending. "Your hat." "But you said—" "I said I wouldn't take it off until I found peace," he interrupted gently. "This morning, when I told you about my wife, about the fire, it was the first time I've spoken of it to anyone. For 5 years, I've carried that grief alone, let it define me, limit me." He took a deep breath. "Then I met you. In just a few days, you've shown me that maybe there's more to life than running from ghosts, that maybe I can honor her memory without sacrificing my future." Hope bloomed in Lillian's chest. "What are you saying, Marshall?" "I'm saying I need to go to Austin, see this through to the end." He reached across the counter, taking her hand. "But then, if you'll have me, I'd like to come back, maybe see if Concord needs a deputy sheriff after all." Tears filled Lillian's eyes. "And the hat?" Marshall smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. "I'm thinking it's time for a new one. This one carries too many sad memories." His expression grew serious. "I can't promise I'm whole, Lillian. There are parts of me that might never be. But if you're willing to be patient with a broken man trying to put himself back together." Lillian circled the counter to stand before him, reaching up to touch his face, the face she'd only ever seen partially hidden by shadow. "We're all broken in some way, Marshall. The question is whether we let someone help us heal." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. "I'll be gone a month, maybe 2. Will you wait?" Instead of answering, Lillian rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips gently to his. Marshall's arms came around her, holding her as if she were precious, fragile, and essential all at once. When they parted, both breathless, she smiled up at him. "I'll wait," she promised. "However long it takes." The following morning, Lillian stood with the rest of the town, watching as the Rangers prepared to depart with their prisoners. Marshall sat atop his horse alongside them, looking different without his hat, more open, somehow more present. As they rode out, he turned back, his eyes finding hers in the crowd. He raised his hand in a gesture that was part wave, part promise, and Lillian returned it, knowing this wasn't an ending but a beginning. 2 months passed slowly for Lillian. She threw herself into her work at the bank, volunteered at the church, helped her father expand the restaurant, anything to keep her mind occupied during the long wait. Letters arrived from Marshall every week, detailing the trial preparations, the Rangers' offer of a permanent position which he declined, his growing certainty that returning to Concord was the right choice. With each letter, Lillian's conviction grew. This was no passing fancy, no dramatic infatuation born of danger and heroism. What she felt for Marshall Rhodes and what he seemed to feel for her was genuine, a connection forged through understanding and acceptance. On a crisp October morning, Lillian was arranging flowers on her parents' dining table when she heard hoofbeats outside. Heart racing, she hurried to the window, then to the door, then down the steps to the street where Marshall was dismounting, travel-worn but smiling. "You're back," she breathed, hardly believing he was real. "I promised I would be," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers as he approached. He wore a new hat lighter in color, less imposing, but removed it as he reached her, tucking it under his arm before taking her hands in his. "The trial?" she asked. "Over. They'll hang Blackburn next month. The others got 20 years each." He squeezed her hands gently. "It's done, Lillian. That chapter's closed." "And now?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. Marshall smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through clouds. "Now I'm hoping Sheriff Morris meant it when he said Concord needs a deputy. And I'm hoping the most beautiful woman in Texas might consider courting a former drifter with a complicated past." Lillian's laugh was pure joy. "I think both could be arranged." In the months that followed, Concord watched with interest as the taciturn deputy courted the banker's daughter with quiet devotion. Marshall settled into town life with surprising ease, his natural authority and fairness making him respected by all. When Sheriff Morris announced his retirement the following spring, the town council unanimously appointed Marshall as his replacement. Lillian and Marshall were married in the summer of 1876, a year after their first meeting. The ceremony, held in Concord's small church, was attended by the entire town, and a contingent of Texas Rangers who'd become Marshall's friends during the Blackburn trial. As they exchanged vows, Marshall wore no hat, his face open to the light streaming through the stained glass windows, his eyes never leaving Lillian's as he promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life. At the reception, held in the town square where they danced that fateful night, Theodore Summers raised a glass to the newlyweds. "To Sheriff and Mrs. Rhodes," he proclaimed, "may your lives be filled with joy, your home with love, and your hearts with peace." Later, as they danced beneath the stars, Lillian rested her head against Marshall's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Happy?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her hair. "Completely," she replied, looking up at him. "And you, any regrets about staying in one place?" Marshall's smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Only that I didn't do it sooner." As the years passed, Marshall and Lillian built a life together in Concord that exceeded both their dreams. The town flourished under Marshall's protection, becoming a hub of commerce as the railroad expanded west. Lillian eventually took over management of the bank, instituting lending practices that helped small ranchers and farmers survive the difficult seasons. Their home, a modest house on the edge of town with a view of the rolling Texas hills, became known for its warm hospitality and open door. Marshall's nightmares grew less frequent with time, though Lillian knew there were still nights when the memories haunted him. On those nights, she would hold him close, reminding him with her presence that he was no longer alone in his grief. In the spring of 1878, their family expanded with the birth of their son, whom they named Thomas Theodore Rhodes. Marshall, who had feared he might be overwhelmed by memories of the child he'd lost, instead found new purpose in fatherhood, approaching it with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything important in his life. 2 years later, their daughter Elizabeth joined the family, her arrival coinciding with Concord's selection as the county seat, a double blessing that the town celebrated with particular enthusiasm. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Marshall took Lillian on a picnic to the spot where he'd proposed, a hilltop overlooking the valley, with wildflowers carpeting the ground in a riot of color. As they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he presented her with a small wooden box. Inside lay his original black hat, carefully preserved. "I don't understand," Lillian said, looking from the hat to her husband in confusion. Marshall took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "For 5 years this hat was a symbol of everything I'd lost," he explained. "For the past 5 years it's been a reminder of everything I've found." He smiled at her, the lines around his eyes crinkling with happiness. "I thought our children might like to know the story someday, how their father was too stubborn to remove his hat, and how their mother's compassion helped heal his broken heart." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "I love you, Marshall Rhodes, hat or no hat. And I love you, Lillian Rhodes, more than I ever thought possible." As they made their way home in the gathering twilight, Lillian reflected on the strange and beautiful path that had led them here. A bank robbery, a mysterious stranger, a hat that concealed both scars and secrets, all coming together to create a love story neither of them had expected, but both now treasured above all else. The old black hat would remain in its box, a tangible reminder of Marshall's journey from grief to healing. But its significance had transformed, no longer a burden of guilt and loss, but a testament to the power of second chances and the unexpected ways love could find even the most wounded heart. And in Concord, Texas, the story would be told for generations. Of the cowboy who never removed his hat until a brave young woman asked why, of the answer that broke her heart and then healed it, and of the life they built together from the ashes of what was lost to the promise of what could be.